Today's briefing is on a report about the place of faith in planning and designing new towns and housing developments. The report is called Housing with Values, Faith and Belief Perspectives on Housing and Community Planning. And it's by the Faith and Belief Policy Collective. The report authors are joining us today to tell us more about it. One of the co-founders is Phil Champagne. Another co-founder is Professor Chris Baker, who is also the William Temple Professor of Religion and Belief in Public Life and the Director of the William Temple Foundation. And the third is Dr. Iona Hine, Programme Manager for the Cambridge Interfaith Programme. And later on, we'll also hear from on-the-ground knowledge from councillors working out the planning process in Faversham in Kent. So welcome to everyone. And we're going to start with you, Phil Champagne, as one of the co-founders of the collective. This is the Faith and Belief Policy Collective. It's the first time that we've done anything produced from your group. Just tell us something about your group and how it was decided to do a report on housing.
Thanks very much, Ruth, and thanks for the opportunity to discuss this important report at the moment. The Faith and Belief Policy Collective is a fairly new group. We were established about a year or so ago, and I think the space it aims to sort of engage with is really the area of government policy, but to bring in the voices of the faith and belief communities. I think it was clear to us when we were discussing this idea that although faith is a really rich part of our society, it's increasingly recognized as an important part of our identity. The importance of learning about diverse faiths is increasingly talked about. There was a gap in terms of its voice at the policy making table. There are individual think tanks that are based on singular faiths, but there was no collective group that brought different faiths and beliefs together to talk about the overall contribution of faith to policy making. And so that was the kind of genesis of this idea.
And why did you decide to pick on housing as the subject of your first report?
Well, we had a discussion of the collective itself is made up of about 40 or so individuals from different faith and belief backgrounds with their own networks and expertise. And we had a discussion with the group, and we came up with a list of issues, but housing was fairly top of the list because it is such an important issue for government. Part of the commitment of the current government is to build 1.5 million new homes. We know it's such an important and critical issue from a policy point of view. And we also had quite a lot of expertise in the group on this issue, including those who are here on the briefing today. So really we chose this, and the next one will be education, but we chose to go with housing, and we know that the new Towns Taskforce has just produced a report. So we think, although there is a lot of noise around faith issues, other faith issues, related issues, we think housing is critical and very timely.
And you follow the new Towns Taskforce report that you just mentioned there, which suggested 12 new towns should be delivered to deliver 1.5 million homes over the next 5 years. And the report itself did acknowledge that faith-based spaces can enrich communities and provide opportunities for personal development. So why did you think that wasn't enough?
Well, I think those who are going to speak after me probably have more to say about this, but I think sort of speaking from my point of view, I think it's one, there are quite a lot of references to faith and the importance of faith in documents, not only on housing, but in other areas. I think the challenge is really getting deep into it and really working through what real partnership means with faith and belief communities. How can that kind of recognition of the importance of the contribution of faith and belief communities, how can that recognition be translated into actual deep partnership working and practical action. And I think that's where there is a deficit, not only in this conversation, but I think more generally around policy issues.
What do you mean exactly that planning councils, when they have planning applications in front of them, are not speaking to faith groups, or other developers not speaking to faith groups? Who is not speaking to the faith groups?
There are conversations going on. I think that you soon come up against this barrier of kind of resource, where there's kind of some willingness to kind of engage with faith communities, but often there's a sort of reliance on voluntary time and on that kind of thing. And it comes down to actually putting some structure and resources into that engagement. And I think that's where often the next phase it becomes unstuck. It's where can you actually how can you translate that willingness? And I think there is a lot of willingness. I think we're kind of reaching a stage in our communities now and amongst government where there is recognition of the need to do this. But I think we need to put some structure and also some resources into this. So, and we'll come to that in terms of the recommendations later on.
Yes. So just briefly on the recommendations, you suggest a new Towns Faith Taskforce. So what will that do?
It will work alongside planners, developers, and government agencies to advise them and to bring the voices of the faith and belief community. But I'd say that broadly, but to bring those voices into discussions about how should these new towns be designed, what is important in terms of the kind of issues around cohesion, community, and trying to meet the needs of different faith groups and faith and belief groups too. So I think it's a conversation, and it's a conversation that needs to be sustained and translate into the plans for these new towns.
Thank you. So can we move on to Professor Chris Baker now? Chris, you're another co-founder of this collective, but you come to this with a lifetime's experience of studying housing, I believe. So you studied some time ago the post-war development of 32 new towns, the garden cities. Thinking about your research into that episode, what were the lessons learned, do you think, from that can be applied to the present government's intention of building 12 new towns?
Thank you, Ruth. Well, I think what emerged from that new town experience, the post-war new town experience, was the importance of creating social infrastructure to go alongside the physical infrastructure. So in the report, we call this infraculture, and it's about making sure that new towns have plenty of opportunities for people to put into practice their beliefs, values, and worldviews. So a particular emphasis in the report was this idea of service. A lot of the witnesses that we spoke to talked about the idea of having the opportunity to serve one's neighbour and to be of service to the new community. And there was a tendency with some of the very top-down planning from the development corporations that design the new towns, that there was a lot of emphasis on the physical infrastructure, quite rightly, roads, hospitals, schools and that sort of thing. But actually, what was really important was the development of this infrastructure, this social capital. And we pointed out that faith groups were very important in generating that. And to be fair to them, and I think this is the challenge facing faith groups today, they did actually manage to coordinate themselves in such a way as to have the conversation with each of the development corporations and say, this is what we can bring to the table as faith groups. Yes, we bring places of worship, we bring places of kind of ritual exchange, which again are very important, but we also bring this kind of social capital to bring to bear. So that's one of the key important ideas. But the other one, I think, refers to this medical syndrome that was discovered as these post-war new towns were built, which was called New Town Blues. And I was a resident of Milton Keynes for several years, and I experienced this myself. It's that kind of real strong sense of dislocation of finding it hard to make connections with people, but also imbibing a public space that's very sterile and has no kind of distinguishing features. And I think faith groups have a particular duty of care, if you like, to make sure that there are spaces of kind of ritual encounter, deep encounter, that remind everybody that, there's more to life than just, if you like, materiality and kind of individuality, that there's the importance of relational connection, but there's also the importance of a kind of connection to something beyond yourself, which more established towns and communities have that kind of infrastructure there.
And there was one part of the report that spoke about building in places that had a kind of common cultural memory within the town into the new developments. How important is that, do you think, Chris?
I think it's really important because I think, again, part of the potential for poor mental health and loneliness and new town blues is the struggle to form an attachment to a place. And there's increasing research that's shown how important it is for things like social cohesion and community resilience that people feel actually attached to places that they live in. And again, there is a tendency to miss that importance of understanding the landscape in which these new towns are built. So what is it about the landscape that we can celebrate that's unique, that gives this place a certain sense of uniqueness that no other place can have? And what can we learn about people who used to live on this land before we moved into it? And where's that sense of character, that sense of a kind of someone used to call it a genius of place. Every place should have a genius that's specific to it. And again, I think faith groups are quite, would have a lot to offer, that kind of understanding of what it means to live in our landscape and to be in touch with deeper roots.
Thank you very much. But I want to bring in now our two guests from Faversham. So we have the Mayor of Faversham, Josh Rowlands, who's the youngest mayor ever in the town. And we have Councillor Charles Gibson, who's the chair of the Swale Borough Council Planning Committee. I think I've got that right, Charles. So I want to ask you about your experience in Faversham. We've been listening to what people have been saying about community building. Charles, first of all, just give us the overview about how big Faversham is at the moment and the extensiveness of the development that it's undergoing in these years.
Just for the official record, I'm the chair of the Planning and Transportation Policy Working Group, which is an enormous mouthful, but boils down to working on our strategic local plan for the borough of Swale. So that project is kind of obviously across all of Swale, which is not just Faversham, it's Sittingbourne and the Isle of Sheppey as well. But over the last 5 to 10 years, a significant proportion of the development around Swale has focused on Faversham. So Faversham at the moment, and those politicians listening will be familiar with how we know about the number of doors because we deliver lots of leaflets to them. So we know with a pretty clear certainty that there are about 10,000 doors in Faversham at the moment. Give or take about 1,000 of those are new in the last 5 years. So that has political implications. The shape of a ward and a division have changed sizably. There's a whole 1,000 new residents that weren't here 5 years ago. We've also got plans over the next 5 years in the pipeline also, is that there are at least 1,500 homes that have already got planning permission on the outskirts of the town. And as many people be aware, the Duchy of Cornwall application, which is on the southeast boundary of the town, has not yet been given planning permission, but is a strategic site that has been long under discussion for 2,500 homes. So over the next 10 years, we could see nearly 4,000 extra homes added to the town, which would be kind of nearly a 50% increase on where we are currently.
Can you add to what we've been hearing about building community? I know this isn't a new town we're talking about here, but we're talking about extensive development of an old town. When you get a planning application before you in the council, do you have a tick list? Do you look for how many doctor's surgeries there are, how many dentists, how many churches, how many schools? How do you assess whether you have enough facilities to cope with the new influx of people?
We certainly do look at that, and it's covered. There are kind of two different ways of covering this, and I suppose the key thing really that comes through in the report is the difference between kind of really good developers who are working strategically and want to build thriving communities and wide scale, and the slightly less good developers who are more interested in profit and speed. And one of our real challenges is Faversham is a medieval town. It's been a port for more than 1,000 years. It's got a pretty concise centre. The centre of the town is pretty small, and there's no room for it to grow. And in order to protect our businesses in the centre of town, we have prioritised not putting business facilities, pubs, community centres, really, on the outskirts of town in these new developments. But what that means is that these new developments on the edge of town are increasingly not walkable. So most of what has currently been built is at the outer edge of walkable. The proposals for the next 4,000, by the sheer geography, are unlikely to be walkable, and so we do increasingly have to look at that, and particularly the Duchy of Cornwall development, which is clearly the largest and is the strategic proposal, does include all of those proposals you've discussed. So community spaces that have been consulted with our local religious groups. So in Faversham, when it's not a hugely diverse town, but we do have a very strong churches together representing the United Reformed, Quakers, Methodists, Church of England, Catholic faiths, all of whom are very active in the town and work very closely together. That group have been involved in some of that work and kind of shaping what the community space would look like. And our particular feedback in Faversham as a very old town, but a modernising town in terms of generations, is that actually what the faith groups in Faversham want is a space that they could use and that is available to the whole community, but they don't want another big building they're responsible for. So there are enough church buildings in Faversham. Some people might suggest more church buildings than we strictly require, but there's plenty of faith groups who are keen to use things at the outskirts of the communities, and we already have that we have a community centre in the west of the town that does host a community church on a Sunday, but is hosting youth groups the rest of the week, gym classes on an evening. He's doing all of these good things, and that's just not possible if we build a standalone new church or new mosque or synagogue in any of these new developments.
It's interesting you say that the move to have a community space rather than a designated mosque or synagogue or a church, that comes from the community not wanting the burden of upkeeping a building. Is that right in every instance when you get a planning application through for a community space? It's the faith groups opting for that.
That's certainly been our experience. I obviously wouldn't speak for the rest of the borough or even the rest of the country, and I'm sure there are plenty of groups with that appetite. But as I say, Faversham is heavily populated with historic buildings that are being upkept by volunteers already. So people with the appetite to do that that opportunity exists in abundance in Faversham. There's plenty of people doing it. There's no appetite for extra currently, but in lots of towns, perhaps there is.
Thank you. Josh, as the mayor of Faversham, when you've been hearing the explanations about, walking distance facilities and so forth, but what impact have all these new developments of houses in the area, those that are up already, had on the way the community works in Faversham? Has it put a strain on the community resources?
So I think it's fair to say that it's a strange one because there is a slight strain that have been put on community resources, as Charles has mentioned. The questions continue to come up when we talk about new developments, and the new developments that are there that are, where are the doctors' surgeries, where are the dentists, where are the community spaces that are needed within those areas. And it is clear that residents of Faversham are quite intent to want those things. As I'm sure people have seen recently, Faversham has made the news for different headline reasons in different media outlets recently, with the rise of the Raise the Flag campaign, amongst others. It's become rather of a hotspot of things, and the idea of it's become a real hotspot of the conversation about faith in Faversham and around actually where religion sits within the communities and actually how it uses. As Charles has sort of said already, that the idea of having community spaces within these areas are something that's actually welcomed by the majority of residents in Faversham. But there are residents that have been here all their lives that have been there, that have been around the Church of England, have been around other churches, but I've not really seen other faiths being welcoming at Faversham. Faversham is a predominantly white town, mostly middle class as it's moved through. There's not a lot of what you describe as middle higher management jobs or those sort of areas. It's very much a class. It's a weird town for that. We're a town that has a lot of people in it that come from strong backgrounds, that come from that actually can afford to live in these houses, can afford to live in these areas. But now we're seeing the residents that have been here all their lives, second, third generation families that have lived in Faversham the whole time, feeling like they're being pushed out. It's not something I agree with, but it's the struggle we're finding at the moment is how we say to residents that have been here for all their lives that actually change is a good thing, and actually building in change into these communities is something that Faversham needs to do. It's a phrase that I've used a lot is that people don't change Faversham, but Faversham changes people. And it changes people for the better, because actually it's that historic town aspect of it that really drives people forward. And you can't help but be in Faversham for more than a year or so and be involved in a volunteering sector somewhere, I find.
Josh, when you have a planning application now, which the town council might discuss for one of these new housing developments, would you have a tick list of this development has to have a doctor's surgery, a dentist, a community space where different groups can gather? Do you have that tick list?
We do have that tick list. I mean, if I'm honest, one of the biggest problems we've had in Faversham in recent times is, and it's been interesting listening to other speakers talk about actually using having community centres built and having these things built. We've struggled getting developers to actually keep their social housing targets and actually not removing those. So it's one of those ones where I sit here and listen and go, we need these community spaces, we need these things that are there. I agree, we do need those things. I'm sort of looking at whereabouts social housing target is, and actually whereabouts actually we need to look at where communities live and how we build that into where we want to be, and actually what we want it to look like in a way. Of course, we have the tick list. We need to see a doctor's surgery, we need to see dentists, we need to see infrastructure put in place. Again, as Charles has mentioned, as the town grows outwards, it becomes more and more difficult to get to the centre. So we've looking at how infrastructure is connected. So actual local cycling, walking infrastructure, things like that, bus routes, different things are there. They're things that are on a tick list.
One other question for you is when the new developments are created, because you don't know who's going to move in. You maybe could guess who might move into those properties, but you don't know the diverse mix of people who may come to a development of, say, 150 properties. So how has the conversation changed in view of the different political makeup of Kent? I mean, you're a Liberal Democrat island in amongst a county that's now run by Reform. You've got a Conservative MP. But have you found, with the rise of Reform and the flag, raise the flag protests, have you found that the conversations that you're having as a community about planning applications are changing in some way?
They are changing in conversations we have within the community. We obviously listen to community groups of all different shapes and sizes. When we discuss them, the conversations have changed very much over the past since Reform took power in Kent. It's very much become we want to house our own. We want to be, this is for Faversham people. And it's that discussion around actually we can work together as a community. We can be welcoming to everyone. We can welcome people that have lived in Faversham their whole lives, while also welcoming people that are new to the town from different areas as well.
If I could just add on that, there is a really key difference we see in the behavior of developers when they start doing the selling process that influences the makeup of an estate, and we see it time after time. You know, there are estates around the edge of Faversham that we go to that are populated almost entirely by people either raised in Faversham or Canterbury or Maidstone or Whitstable, you know, within a kind of 10-mile radius of the town, because that's where the developers chose to advertise. And then there are other estates who've been built by national house builders and have been advertised nationally as part of a scheme, where of the 150 houses, you'd be lucky to find 5 people who knew about Faversham 5 years ago. They've mostly come down from London, from Manchester, from wherever, and that's a choice that developers are making, and it's not within council's gifts to change that. But I do think there's a point that the diversity of who ends up living in a place is something developers should be held accountable for and should think about, because how they do that advertising and how they design that, particularly with the new towns we're talking about, it would be entirely possible to do that in a kind of county focused way. So the home county of the new town should be where we advertise those new homes to, and then we don't break down those cultural networks that are so important. The estates where lots of people live near their family are much more successful. They have visiting grandparents, aunties and uncles around the corner, all of those things that make positive communities. And the estates that aren't like that have got family in London or further afield, have different needs, and it creates those real challenges. But sadly, the planning process has no kind of recourse over that. But there are tools available that developers in particular could use to make those positive impacts.
Interesting. We'll get some comments back on that. Thank you very much, Charles and Josh. Iona, can I bring you back in again? Can I talk to you about Northstowe, this community in North Cambridge? Because they also have been talking about building community centres instead of bespoke faith buildings for one particular faith or another. What can you tell us about the kind of discussions that have gone on there? They've had a faith strategy group which has been meeting to discuss who goes where and how they make the decisions. And this was a very new and innovative thing with people who were just moving into the community for the first time. What can you tell us about what happened in Northstowe?
Thanks. So Northstowe, it's about 5 miles out of Cambridge. It is a new town, effectively. The plan is for 10,000 houses. They're, I think, closing in on 2,000 houses at this point in time. And they're midway through building the community centre. The initial complaints, of course, were that there wasn't a community space, but the community centre should open next year. Now, actually, there is a bid out right at this moment. It's a 12-month process for land for faith and volunteer use. So it's faith or volunteer. And that's come out from the process of this faith strategy group. So I think Cambridgeshire in particular, there was some work done and a report issued, I think 2008, that was exploring the role of faith groups and faith communities, and identified some good practice, and I can see that being implemented in Northstowe. So, for example, referencing off current population, Cambridge being and Cambridgeshire being an area where there's a need for significant need for more housing, that kind of calculated what's an appropriate amount of space to give over to a place of worship, for example, and then they are operationalising that within the work in Northstowe, and they have convened this kind of multi-faith group based on those who want to be living in Northstowe, those who are living in Northstowe now, to think that over together, and that group has had sort of approvals over this process of what the bidding would be like, what would be asked. And one of the things, I think this is really important, one of the things that you would find within what groups are asked to come up with when asked, bidding for the use of this land, is that they're inclusive. So because one of the things we encountered in the interviews and the reports is the kind of notion sometimes people are afraid to talk about faith groups. Sometimes they're afraid that giving space to one faith group might kind of mean favoritism or might create tensions down the line. And I think that kind of, or that it might create boundaries, it might create a resource, a building that some people can use but isn't appropriate for others. And I think it's quite clear in the kind of the way that they have put that process together, that they've done it in a way that allows enough time for groups that might be under-resourced to really put a solid proposal together. And they've done it with that recognition. And this is, something we've heard from the Faversham kind of case, that faith communities are often really good at upkeeping a building. And community buildings often get used for all kinds of things during the week. And it is the case, if you were to look at a good number of faith communities in the UK, that they are both providing a space of worship on key days in the week, but also they are running that facility. They are using that large space to provide all kinds of other services. So food banks, space for youth groups, space for sort of knit and natter, all kinds of community things. And that's part of what kind of collaboration with faith groups and thinking this over collectively can help with.
Thank you. Can I bring you back in, Professor Chris Baker, now, just for some reflections on the discussion that it's gone so far. Just picking up what Iona was saying there about the conversations that you've had in your research that indicate, there's a quote here. It is our view that the current understanding of and attention to faith and belief as contributors to the planning process is underdeveloped and has yet to embrace Britain's faith and belief communities as partners. And further, you speak about cases where religion and belief is bracketed out. And there's another person who spoke to another witness who said some participants felt institutional assumptions from planners as neutral, while characterising faith-based viewpoints as inappropriate for public decision-making. Just tell us a bit more about this widespread antipathy towards faith groups that you discovered in your research.
Yes, well, it goes back, I think, to the conversation you're having earlier with Phil. I mean, I think there are clearly some examples of good practice when it comes to consultation and engagement with faith groups, but there were substantial stories and experiences offered by our witnesses to go against the contrary. And I still think there's, within certain professional sectors of public policy, a kind of residual enlightenment view of religion that I think it should be seen and not heard, that somehow religious experience and religious identities and the way that people talk about the importance of things like community and belonging don't have somehow the same validity as knowledge and experience that comes from experts. So I think there is clear evidence of a what we call in the report a weak faith literacy that can cut across the diversity and plurality that Newtown communities will represent, and faith is a driver of diversity and plurality as well as an expression of it. I don't want to dwell too much, though. I mean, it's important that we don't dwell too much on the kind of these fault lines that are clearly there. And I wanted just to pick up on some of the very helpful and insightful reports from our the councillor and the mayor around the kind of difficulties of integrating old and new communities, and the way that which we pick up in our report as well. There are the way in which certain developments are advertised, and the kind of the mindset and horizon of the developer very much reinforces a kind of ghettoized use of space. So what came out from our research, which I think is relevant, is the importance of connectivity, and how do we create spaces, how do we create bridges where different communities can connect with each other, and where for example, old and new residents can connect. And several of our witnesses said that faith groups have something to offer in this area because they're often very well established. They have insider knowledge of the community, and they understand the importance of creating connectivity between different communities. So I think there's something here about connectivity and faith and belief. And there's also an idea that emerges very strongly from, if you look at ideas of infraculture. How do we create this idea that we share a common space? How do we create this idea of a commons as soon as possible? And what are the practical ways in which we can do that? And I just wanted to, if you don't mind, I just want to read very, very quickly a quote from the report, which I think describes in practice how one might begin to instill these practices of connectivity and creating a commons. Infraculture, as defined and interpreted by our witnesses, and there is a whole literature out there on infraculture which we reference in the report, suggests that a flourishing community that has a sense of commons that is co-created and hence unique to each town and new settlement. This begins with shared values of welcome, hospitality, and neighbourliness that in turn support practical modes of living alongside and attending to local need in respect of healthcare, mental well-being, economic development, training, food cultivation, and provision. These goals can be achieved through careful but sustained long-term partnership to ensure that as much of the relational, social, and economic capital created within a community stays within the community. So I think that's central to it. We need to talk about this in terms of creating local communities where everyone shares the benefits of what's produced, the added value that people bring when they come into a new town, a new settlement.
Thank you very much. I noticed on the call we have Jennifer Eggert, Dr. Jennifer Eggert, and Mohammed Ali Amna, and I think you both contributed to this report as well, didn't you? What are your reflections on the conversation, particularly about what Chris was just saying about developing community? Jennifer, perhaps I could go to you first.
I'm Director of Policy and Research at EQUI, which is a think tank that draws on British Muslim insight to develop policy solutions that benefit everyone in society. So that's the perspective that I'm going to speak from. And you might have noticed I'm also a Muslim woman. So I did also in the report share some of that personal lived experience. Now, what I would say, and that goes back to what Chris was just speaking about now, secular bias remains a key issue when we talk about these kind of topics. This assumption that secular perspectives are inherently neutral and therefore better than faith-based perspectives. And that's simply not the case, because every perspective comes from a certain standpoint. There is just no neutrality in that sense. So an awareness of who might I be excluding and who might I be pushing to the side and not giving a space to share their voices and their experience, that's a risk whichever approach you're taking, be it secular or faith-based. Another point that is really, really important in this context is the need for intersectional approaches. And that's an academic term that might make sense to the academics in the room. For everyone else, it just means that we are aware of the intersections, so the interactions, you could also say, between different factors, such as religion, which we're obviously speaking about now, but then also race, ethnicity, gender, class. To give an example based on lived experience, I often come across these lists of the best places to live in the UK, the nicest villages, the greatest towns. And I often, when I, as a Muslim woman, visibly Muslim woman, when I look at these lists, they look like lovely places. But from experience, I know I wouldn't feel comfortable living in a lot of them, because when I go, I get stares and I'm not made feel welcome. Right? So that's something that an intersectional approach where you look at how different factors such as race, religion, ethnicity, gender, class, and so on impact people's experiences of our cities, of our towns, of our neighborhoods, just is really important. And when it comes to engagement and inclusion with faith actors, but also secular actors, obviously we're speaking about faith communities here now. What that means is that when we speak with faith actors, we go to a mosque, we go to a church, we go to a temple, we don't just speak with the men. It's really important then, again, to bring an intersectional perspective and say, yes, the men are there. In lots of cases, they make up large parts of the leadership boards, but we don't just speak with the men. We make sure that we engage with men, with women, with young people, with people of different racial backgrounds.
There was something in the report I did notice that said it was important to talk to people at a granular level rather than a collective, as you know, an interfaith group. And Mohammed, can I come to you? What's your reflection?
I think it's really important, particularly right now, and for some of you, and particularly Chris and others, I've heard me mention about the importance of thinking about intersectionality of identities, but also what does that currently mean when the cohesion discourse in Britain is often thinking about race and faith, but often is neglecting the discourse on thinking about Islamophobia. And what does that mean, particularly when it comes to housing in Britain and communities? What I'm seeing in various parts of Britain, particularly a withdrawing of some communities in feeling more comfortable in living in areas where they feel they're going to be in a minority. I live in West Yorkshire, in a very rural part of what is considered Bradford. And many of my friends, or some of my friends, when I visit them in the more urban parts of Bradford, they're like, "Oh, you're brave living out there." And I think, unfortunately, that's often the case with many Muslim communities who feel they're now wanting to withdraw and segregate because they feel at threat. And unfortunately for many, particularly if you look back to the 70s and 80s, that's something that took place then as well. Because particularly for my father's generation and my grandfather's generation, when they moved, to Britain, they were faced with the National Front. They were faced with racist abuse. They were faced with what was commonly known as P-bashing. But again, it took an intersectional Islamophobic nature back then, but we didn't have the language to speak about it in that way. And what that meant was, for protection, many communities segregated and focused on living in a particular geographical area. And what we've seen, even with the increase of Islamophobia in the last 20 years, is that Muslim communities have gone from those centralized protective communities and filtered out into wider British society. But as Jennifer said, some Muslims will not feel safe in certain cities, certain rural parts of the country. And particularly now with the colours, what we're finding is some Muslim communities, and I'm making a generalization here, are feeling under threat, feeling under attack, feeling they don't want to face racism, Islamophobia out in communities, and therefore now drawing back into some, I'm not going to use the word insular, and I'm going to resist the urge to use that, but areas or communities where they feel there is a greater level of protection.
Thank you for your contribution there. I think as we draw all the various strands together, I'll go back to you, Phil. I know you've had a conversation in the chat box about examples from Europe that might be appropriate or worth looking at here. But having listened to the conversation, what do you think the next steps are for the government as it creates these new towns, comes up with the plans? Have you had approaches, for example, from the government to enter into negotiations or conversations already with anyone?
Well, we're regularly in touch with government, particularly MHCLG on this. I did reach out to see if somebody could join this briefing with no success, sadly. But I think the door is open there with MHCLG, and I look forward to kind of following up with conversations with them. I think it was really fascinating listening to this call, and particularly Charles and Josh from their kind of real experience in Faversham. It reminded me of the fact that every place is different, and there's not a blueprint for this. So in terms of in terms of the outcomes, I think what we need to do is to try and set up a process that can help take forward some of the ideas contained in this report, and some of the kind of complexities of it, and try and make a contribution to making this next phase of house building a real contribution to social cohesion. Because at the moment, as we know, and a lot of the comments today have been set against this backdrop of some of these fault lines in our communities. And I think housing and our ability to kind of live with each other well housing is an integral part of that, and what people feel they're getting from community and from the sense of belonging. So there's a really important moment here, and I really hope that that government will kind of join together with faith and belief communities to set up a new Towns Faith Taskforce, which I think could make an important contribution. Obviously, the devil's in the detail, but I think that's the next part of the conversation with them, is to discuss the idea and to get more input to that idea.
Thank you very much indeed, everyone, for taking part today.